My name is Bailey Gregory, and I'm 64 years old. Some people think that makes me weak, vulnerable, or desperate for family approval. Those people have never met me. I spent 42 years as a registered nurse, working double shifts, saving every penny I could squeeze from my modest salary. By the time I retired 3 years ago, I had built something I was proud of, a $500,000 nest egg that represented decades of sacrifice, discipline, and careful planning. That money wasn't just numbers in a bank account. It was my security, my dignity, my proof that a woman could take care of herself without depending on anyone. I should have known that my son Daniel would eventually come for it. The evening it all began, I was in my small but immaculate apartment, the one I'd moved to after my husband passed 5 years ago. I'd made it beautiful with the antiques I'd collected over the years, my grandmother's china displayed in glass cabinets, and fresh flowers that I bought myself every Friday because no one else would. I was reading a novel, wearing my favorite pearl necklace, the one my husband gave me for our 20th anniversary, when the doorbell rang. Daniel stood there with Rebecca, his wife of 7 years. Even before they opened their mouths, I could see the desperation in their eyes. Daniel, at 38, still had that boyish face that had gotten him out of trouble so many times as a child. But tonight he looked haggard, older than his years. Rebecca, 35 and sharp as a blade, wore her blonde hair in a perfect bob and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. "Mom, we need to talk," Daniel said, not bothering with pleasantries. They pushed past me into my living room, settling onto my cream-colored sofa like they owned the place. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, still clinging to the rituals of hospitality that my mother had drilled into me. "We don't have time for that," Rebecca snapped. She'd never liked me, not from the first day Daniel brought her home. I was competition for his attention, a reminder of the life he'd had before her, and she resented every penny I'd spent on his education, every birthday gift, every Christmas bonus I'd given him over the years. Daniel cleared his throat, the way he used to when he was 7 and had broken something. "Mom, we're in trouble. Real trouble. The bank is threatening to foreclose on our house." I set down my book and studied their faces. "How much do you owe?" "200,000, Daniel said quietly. "Maybe a little more with late fees and interest." I'd suspected this moment would come. Daniel had always been careless with money, always reaching for the next big purchase before he could afford the last one. The house they'd bought 3 years ago was far beyond their means, a sprawling colonial in the most expensive neighborhood in town, complete with granite countertops and a 3-car garage. I'd tried to warn them then, but Rebecca had smiled her cold smile and said they were building wealth. "How did you let it get this bad?" I asked. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she wanted to make me feel small. "Bailey, we don't have time for lectures. We need a solution. And frankly, you're the only one who can help us." The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter in her mouth, made my chest tighten. This woman, who had never worked a day in her life, who spent her time at yoga classes and shopping for organic vegetables, was talking to me like I was a child. "What exactly are you asking?" I said, though I already knew. Daniel took my hand, the way he used to when he wanted something as a boy. "Mom, you have that retirement money sitting in the bank. We're your family. We need you to pay off our mortgage." The words hung in the air like smoke. $500,000. My entire life's work. That's my retirement, Daniel. That money is meant to last me the rest of my life. Rebecca laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Come on, Bailey. How much money does one old woman really need? You live in this tiny apartment. You don't travel. You don't buy anything. What are you saving it for?" "Old woman." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Besides," she continued, "wouldn't you rather help your only son keep his home? Isn't that what mothers are supposed to do?" I looked at Daniel, searching his face for some sign of the boy I'd raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions he'd picked from the yard and call them beautiful flowers. But all I saw was a man who had learned to let his wife speak for him, who sat there nodding as she insulted the woman who had given him everything. "If I do this," I said slowly, "what happens to me when I need long-term care? What happens when I can't take care of myself anymore?" Rebecca shrugged. "You'll figure it out. You always do." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This woman, who had never struggled for anything, was dismissing 40 years of my hard work like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. "And if I don't give you the money?" Daniel and Rebecca exchanged a look. When Daniel spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "Then I guess we won't be able to have you in our lives anymore. Rebecca doesn't want the kids around negative energy, and if you're not going to help family when we need it most, then what's the point?" The kids. My grandchildren, Emma and Noah, 8 and 6 years old. The only bright spots left in my world since my husband died. They were using them as leverage, dangling the promise of seeing them grow up like a carrot I'd never reach. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively going to my pearl necklace. These pearls had been with me through everything: my wedding, Daniel's birth, my husband's funeral. They were smooth and warm against my fingers, a reminder of better times. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You want me to give you my entire life savings, every penny I've worked for over 40 years, or you'll cut me out of your lives completely." "It's not like that, Mom," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's exactly like that," Rebecca said, standing to face me. She was taller than me by 3 inches, and she used every bit of that height to look down at me. "You can either be useful to this family, or you can be alone. Your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my antique clock ticking on the mantel, the same clock that had marked time in my childhood home. I thought about all the nights I'd worked overtime to pay for Daniel's college, all the vacations I'd skipped to put money away for retirement, all the small sacrifices that had added up to this moment. "I need to think about it," I said finally. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "What's to think about?" "It's a simple question, Bailey. Are you going to help your family or not?" But I was already walking toward the door, my hand on the handle. "I think it's time for you to leave." Daniel started to protest, but Rebecca grabbed his arm. "But we need an answer by tomorrow night. The bank isn't going to wait forever." After they left, I sat in my chair and stared at the space where they'd been. The cushions still held the impression of their bodies, an unwelcome reminder of what had just happened. I thought about my husband, how he'd warned me that Daniel was getting too comfortable taking from us without giving anything back. I defended our son then, said he was just going through a rough patch, that all young people needed help getting started. But this wasn't help. This was theft dressed up as obligation. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the small suitcase I kept in my closet, the one I'd bought for weekend trips I never took because I was too busy saving money. Piece by piece, I packed my most precious belongings, the pearls, a few photographs, my grandmother's wedding ring, and enough clothes for a week. I left the apartment that night with only what I could carry, locking the door behind me and sliding the key under my neighbor's door with a note asking her to water my plants. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there, surrounded by the expectations and demands of people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with legs. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask too many questions. As I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. They wanted me to choose between my money and my family. They'd given me an ultimatum, expecting me to cave like I always had before. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was still the same woman who would sacrifice anything for her son's happiness. That woman died the moment Rebecca called me an old woman who didn't need much. What remained was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. They wanted my money. They would get exactly what they deserved. The motel room smelled like disinfectant and other people's disappointments. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase open beside me, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt this alone. Not lonely alone. There's a difference. Lonely is missing someone. Alone is realizing that the people you thought you could count on were never really there at all. I picked up my phone 3 times to call Daniel, to tell him I'd changed my mind, that I'd give them whatever they needed. Each time, I set it back down. The woman who would have made that call was gone. In her place was someone I was just beginning to meet. I thought about the first time Daniel had asked me for money. He was 22, fresh out of college, and wanted to buy a car he couldn't afford. I'd written the check without question, proud that I could help my son start his adult life with something nice. Then there was the credit card debt when he was 25, the down payment for his first apartment at 28, the loan for his wedding at 31. Always something. Always a crisis that only Mom's checkbook could solve. When had I become nothing more than a source of funding? The morning sun was filtering through the thin motel curtains when I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bicycle, cheered for at every baseball game, had looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless if I couldn't pay his debts. His wife had called me old and useless, and he'd sat there and let her. But as I sat there in that depressing room, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I began to feel something else entirely. Curiosity. What would happen if I disappeared from their lives completely? How long would it take them to realize that their problems weren't going to solve themselves? And more importantly, what could I do with the power I'd never realized I had? I pulled out my tablet and logged into my bank account. There it was, $487,329.42. Not quite the $500,000 I'd told people about, but close enough. Money I'd earned by working Christmas shifts while other mothers were home with their families. Money I'd saved by buying generic groceries and driving cars until they literally couldn't run anymore. Money that represented every sacrifice I'd made in the name of security and independence. They thought this money was theirs for the asking. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I started researching. It's amazing what you can learn on the internet when you have time and motivation. I looked up their address, their mortgage company, their payment history. Public records are a beautiful thing when you know where to look. Daniel and Rebecca had purchased their house 3 years ago for $425,000, putting down only 5%. Their monthly payment was over $3,000, not including insurance and taxes. They'd refinanced twice in 3 years, each time taking out more money, increasing their debt instead of paying it down. The records showed they were 4 months behind on payments. The foreclosure notice had already been filed. They had maybe 6 weeks before the bank took the house back. I found myself smiling for the first time since they'd darkened my doorway. They were in much worse shape than they'd let on. This wasn't a temporary setback they needed help with. This was a complete financial collapse they'd been hiding for months. My phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Mom? Mom, where are you? Your neighbor said you left. His voice was tight with panic, and I felt a familiar tug in my chest. The old Bailey would have rushed to reassure him, to smooth over his worry and make everything better. The new Bailey let the phone ring until it stopped. He called 6 more times. Then Rebecca called. Then Daniel again. I turned off the phone and went to take a shower in the tiny motel bathroom, letting the hot water wash away 40 years of being taken for granted. When I came out, I had 14 missed calls and 11 text messages. Mom, please call me back. We need to talk. Bailey, this is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. Mom, I'm sorry if we upset you. Can we please work this out? Where are you? This isn't funny anymore. I deleted every message without reading them completely. Instead, I got dressed, put on my pearls, and drove to the public library. I spent the next 4 hours researching real estate law, foreclosure procedures, and auction processes. I learned that when a house goes to foreclosure auction, anyone with cash can bid. I learned that most foreclosure auctions happen on courthouse steps, with minimal advertising. I learned that houses often sell for much less than they're worth because most people don't know about the auctions or don't have the cash to participate. Most importantly, I learned that Daniel and Rebecca's house would be auctioned in 5 weeks. The librarian, a sweet woman about my age, asked if I was looking into buying property. Something like that, I said, printing out pages of legal documents and auction schedules. Good for you, dear. It's never too late to make a smart investment. Investment. I like the sound of that. That afternoon, I called Richard Cole. We dated briefly 15 years ago, after my husband died. Nothing serious, just dinner a few times and long conversations about books and music. He was a good man, a widower like me, but neither of us was ready for anything complicated. We'd remained friendly over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and the occasional phone call. Bailey. His voice was warm with genuine pleasure. What a nice surprise. How are you holding up?
I'm fine, Richard.
Actually, I was wondering if I could pick your brain about something. I know you handle real estate law. Of course. What can I help you with? I chose my words carefully. If someone wanted to buy a house at a foreclosure auction, what would that process look like? Thinking of getting into real estate investment, he chuckled. Good for you. Most people are too timid to take advantage of opportunities like that. He spent 20 minutes explaining the process, the paperwork, the cashier's checks required, the due diligence needed before bidding. He offered to help if I was serious about pursuing it. I might be, I said. I'll let you know. Bailey, he said before we hung up, I don't know what's prompted this new interest, but I think it's wonderful. You've always been too conservative with money. Sometimes you have to take risks to get what you want. That evening, I sat in the motel restaurant, a dismal place with fluorescent lighting and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, and made lists. Lists of what I knew, what I needed to learn, what I needed to do. By the time I finished my meal, I had a plan. It wasn't a plan for reconciliation or forgiveness. It wasn't a plan to teach Daniel and Rebecca a lesson they might learn from. It was a plan for absolute, complete, irreversible devastation. They'd given me an ultimatum: give them my money or lose my family. They were about to discover that there was a third option they hadn't considered. I could take their home and keep my money. The old Bailey would have been horrified by the thoughts running through my mind. The old Bailey believed in forgiveness, in family loyalty, in doing the right thing even when others didn't. But the old Bailey was gone, and she wasn't coming back. I raised my coffee cup in a toast to my empty motel room. Here's to new beginnings, I whispered. Outside, it began to rain, and I found the sound soothing instead of melancholy. Rain washes things clean, makes room for new growth. Sometimes destruction is just another word for opportunity. My phone rang again. Daniel's name on the screen. This time, I answered. Hello, Daniel.
Mom.
Thank God.
Where are you?
We've been worried sick. No, you haven't. You've been worried about your mortgage payment. Silence on the other end. Mom, please come home. Let's talk about this like adults. I am talking like an adult. That's the problem. I'm finally seeing this situation clearly. What do you mean? I mean, I've made my decision, Daniel. About your ultimatum. I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. And I choose to lose my family. I hung up and turned off the phone again. Then I sat back in the uncomfortable restaurant booth and planned the systematic destruction of everything my son thought he was entitled to. Some stories end with forgiveness and healing. This isn't one of them. Before we continue with Bailey's story, I want to share something important with you. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Bailey's journey of reclaiming her power is just beginning, and just like her, you have the strength to rewrite your story. Don't let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. Like this video if Bailey's courage inspires you, subscribe for more empowering stories, and hit that notification bell because her revenge is about to get much, much colder. The next morning, I woke up with more energy than I'd felt in years. While Daniel and Rebecca were probably lying awake wondering where their cash cow had gone, I was making lists and checking off items like a general preparing for war. First stop, the courthouse. I wanted to see the foreclosure filing with my own eyes to understand exactly how much time we were working with. The clerk, a efficient woman with kind eyes, helped me navigate the public record system. Here it is, she said, pulling up the file on her computer. Gregory, Daniel, and Rebecca. 47 Maple Street. Filed 3 weeks ago. I studied the documents carefully. The amount owed was actually higher than Daniel had told me, $247,000 plus late fees and court costs. The auction was scheduled for 4 weeks from today, 10 a.m. on the courthouse steps. Does this mean the house could sell for less than what's owed? I asked. Oh, absolutely. Depending on the condition and the bidding, foreclosure properties often sell for 60 to 70 cents on the dollar. Sometimes less if there aren't many bidders. I felt that familiar flutter of excitement in my chest, the same feeling I used to get when I found a perfect antique at a yard sale for a fraction of its value. Thank you, I said. You've been very helpful. Next, I drove to Maple Street. I hadn't been to Daniel and Rebecca's house in over a year. They usually preferred to meet at restaurants when they needed something from me, claiming their house was too messy for company. Looking at it now, I understood why. The colonial that had once been pristine was showing signs of neglect. The paint was peeling around the window frames, the landscaping was overgrown, and one of the garage doors was hanging crooked. This wasn't just financial stress. This was a couple who had given up on maintaining their facade. I parked across the street and took photographs with my phone. If I was going to bid on this property, I needed to understand what I was buying. I walked around the perimeter, noting every flaw, every repair that would be needed. The roof looked sound, the foundation seemed solid, but there was work to be done. More importantly, I needed to know what the house was actually worth. I called a real estate agent I'd met at my book club, Helen Martinez. Bailey, how lovely to hear from you. Are you thinking of moving? Possibly. I was wondering if you could give me a quick market analysis on a property. Nothing formal, just a ballpark figure. I gave her the address and waited while she looked it up on her computer. Oh, this is a beautiful neighborhood. This particular house, let me see, based on recent sales of similar properties, I'd estimate the fair market value at around $380,000. It's a good solid house in a desirable area. $380,000. If I could buy it at auction for $200,000 or less, I'd be getting it for nearly half its value. And Daniel and Rebecca would be out on the street. Perfect. I called Richard Cole again that afternoon. Richard, it's Bailey. I've been thinking more about that foreclosure auction we discussed. Wonderful. Have you found a property you're interested in? I have. I'd like to hire you to handle the paperwork and make sure everything is legal and proper. Of course. What's the address? I gave him Daniel's address and heard a sharp intake of breath. Bailey, isn't this your son's house? It is. A long pause. I see. May I ask what's going on here? I prepared for this question. Richard was a good man and he deserved an honest answer, or as honest as I was willing to be. My son and his wife recently informed me that if I don't give them my entire retirement savings, they don't want me in their lives anymore. They seem to think I'm too old and useless to need my own money.
Oh, Bailey, I'm so sorry.
That's unconscionable. Yes, it is. And I've decided to take them at their word. If they don't want me as their mother, then I don't want them as my beneficiaries. This house is going to auction, and I intend to buy it. And then, and then I'll decide what to do with it. It's a good investment property, don't you think? Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Bailey, I want to make sure you've thought this through. This is a very serious step. There won't be any going back. Richard, I've spent 3 days thinking about nothing else. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. All right then, let's do this properly. We spent the next hour going over the logistics. Richard would represent me at the auction, bidding on my behalf. We'd need a cashier's check for the full amount, plus additional funds for closing costs and fees. He'd handle all the paperwork to ensure the purchase was legal and binding. One more thing, I said before we hung up. I want this kept completely confidential until the sale is final. No one should know I'm the buyer. Of course. Attorney-client privilege. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant in the next town over, the kind of place Daniel and Rebecca would have considered too expensive for someone my age. I ordered wine with my meal and raised my glass to toast my reflection in the restaurant window. To new investments, I whispered. My phone had been buzzing all day with calls and texts from Daniel and Rebecca. I'd ignored every one of them, let them stew in their panic, wondering where I'd gone and whether I was coming back with my checkbook. But curiosity finally got the better of me, and I scrolled through the messages while I waited for dessert. Mom, please stop playing games. We need to know what you've decided. Bailey, this silent treatment is childish. Call us back. The bank called today.
We need to talk now. Mom, I'm scared.
Please don't abandon us. That last one almost got to me. Almost. But then I remembered Rebecca's laugh when she called me an old woman, and the feeling passed. I typed a single response. I told you I made my decision. You'll hear from me when I'm ready. Then I blocked both their numbers. The waiter brought my dessert, creme brulee, something I'd never ordered before because I'd always thought it was too indulgent. It was delicious, rich and sweet and completely unnecessary. I savored every bite. On the drive back to the motel, I realized I was humming. I hadn't hummed in years. There was something liberating about finally admitting that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had actually been keeping a very detailed scorecard all along. I spent the rest of the evening researching property management companies. If I was going to own rental property, I wanted professionals handling the details. I found a company with excellent reviews and made a note to call them after the auction. Before bed, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror and really looked at myself for the first time in months. My hair was silver white, pulled back in the neat bun I'd worn for years. My skin showed the lines of 64 years, but my eyes were bright and sharp. I was still wearing my pearls, and they caught the light as I moved. "Hello, Bailey," I said to my reflection. "Nice to finally meet you." I'd spent so many years being Daniel's mother, my husband's wife, the nurse who took care of everyone else, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be just myself. It felt powerful. Tomorrow, I would start the process of becoming a property owner. In 4 weeks, I would own the house that my son thought he was entitled to. And after that... Well, after that we'd see what other surprises life had in store. Some people might call what I was planning cruel. I called it justice. The difference is that justice doesn't require forgiveness, and I was fresh out of that particular commodity. Auction day arrived with the crisp clarity of an autumn morning. I'd barely slept, not from nerves, but from anticipation. It felt like Christmas morning when I was a child, that electric feeling of knowing something wonderful was about to happen. I dressed carefully that morning. My best navy blue suit, my pearls, and the watch my husband had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look respectable, dignified, like someone who belonged among serious investors. More importantly, I wanted to look like someone who could afford to write a very large check. Richard met me at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. He looked concerned, the way good friends do when they think you're making a mistake but care too much to stop you. "Bailey, you know I'll do whatever you ask me to do," he said, stirring his coffee methodically. "But I need to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this?" "Richard, 3 weeks ago I thought I had a family. I thought my son loved me, that his wife respected me, that my grandchildren would remember me fondly. Then they told me I was worthless unless I handed over my life savings." "Yes, I'm certain." He nodded slowly. "All right then. I have the cashier's check for $250,000 and I've done the title research. The property is clear except for the mortgage debt. If we win the bidding, we can close immediately." We walked to the courthouse together. It was exactly 9:45 a.m., and there were already about 20 people gathered on the steps. Most of them looked like professional investors. Men in suits carrying folders and clipboards, their faces showing the bored efficiency of people who did this regularly. I recognized a few neighbors from Daniel Street in the crowd. Probably they're out of curiosity more than anything else. Mrs. Patterson from next door caught my eye and waved. I waved back politely, wondering what she'd think when she found out who had purchased her neighbor's home. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice that carried clearly across the courthouse steps. He read through the legal description of the property, the terms of the sale, and the minimum bid requirements. Everything sounded official and final, like a funeral service for Daniel and Rebecca's dreams. "We'll start the bidding at $180,000, the auctioneer announced. 3 hands went up immediately. This was more interest than Richard had expected, and I felt my first flutter of genuine anxiety. What if I couldn't afford to win? What if someone outbid me and ruined everything? The bidding moved quickly. $185,000, $190,000, $195,000. One by one, bidders dropped out as the price climbed. By the time we reached $220,000, only 2 hands were still going up, Richard's and one other man's. $225,000, $230,000, $235,000. The other bidder hesitated when Richard signaled $240,000. The auctioneer called out, "Do I hear $245,000? Silence. $240,000 going once, going twice. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it.
Sold.
To bidder number 7 for $240,000. Richard turned to me with a slight smile. "Congratulations, Bailey. You just bought a house." The paperwork took 2 hours. Richard handled most of it while I sat in the courthouse cafe, drinking terrible coffee and watching people go about their normal day. None of them knew that I'd just purchased my son's home out from under him. None of them would understand why that felt like the most satisfying thing I'd done in years. When Richard found me, he was carrying a folder thick with documents. "It's done," he said. "The deed will be recorded this afternoon. The house is legally yours." I opened the folder and stared at the deed. There it was in black and white. Bailey Gregory, a single woman, was now the owner of 47 Maple Street. The house where my grandchildren lived. The house where my son had told me I was worthless. "Richard," I said, "I need to hire a property management company. I don't want to deal with the eviction process directly." "Of course. I can recommend someone excellent. Patricia Wilson. She's handled difficult situations before."
Perfect.
"I want them to serve the eviction notice tomorrow morning." Richard's eyebrows went up slightly, but he didn't comment. "That can be arranged. What about utilities and maintenance?" I want everything transferred to my name immediately. If there are any past due bills, pay them. I want this to be completely legal and proper. We spent another hour going over the details. Patricia Wilson would handle the eviction, which would give Daniel and Rebecca 30 days to vacate. The utility companies would transfer service to my name. A locksmith would change all the locks the day after the eviction was complete. I wrote checks for everything: the property management company, the utility transfers, the locksmith, and Richard's legal fees. Each check felt like a small victory, proof that I had the power to change my circumstances instead of simply enduring them. "What will you do with the house after they're gone?" Richard asked as we walked back to our cars. "I haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll rent it out. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe I'll just sit on my front porch and enjoy the peace and quiet." He laughed. "Your front porch. I like the sound of that." That evening, I moved out of the motel and into a furnished apartment I'd rented by the month. It was small but clean, with a kitchenette and a view of the park where I used to take Daniel when he was little. I could afford something nicer now. After all, I just made a very good investment, but I liked the simplicity of it. I made myself dinner and poured a glass of the expensive wine I'd bought to celebrate. Then I sat by the window and called Patricia Wilson. "Mrs. Wilson, this is Bailey Gregory. Richard Cole referred me to you regarding property management services." "Yes, Mrs. Gregory. Congratulations on your purchase today." Richard briefed me on the situation. "This is unusual, but not unheard of. I want the eviction notice served first thing tomorrow morning. I want everything done by the book, completely legal and professional." "Of course. My assistant will be there at 9 a.m. sharp. The current residents will have 30 days from the date of service to vacate the premises." "What if they refuse to leave?" "Then we proceed with legal eviction through the courts. It can take a few extra weeks, but we'll get them out. I've handled much more difficult cases." "Excellent. Please keep me informed of every step." After I hung up, I sat in my chair and thought about Daniel and Rebecca going about their evening, probably still hoping I'd call with news that I'd decided to pay their mortgage after all. They had no idea that in 12 hours, they'd learned that not only was I not saving their house, I was the reason they were losing it. I thought about the conversation we'd have when they found out. Daniel would be shocked, hurt, probably angry. Rebecca would be furious, probably calling me names I'd never heard from her before. They'd demand explanations, threaten to take legal action, promise they'd never speak to me again. The last part didn't bother me at all. In fact, it sounded like a promise I hoped they'd keep. I raised my wine glass toward the window, toward the house I now owned across town, toward the son who thought he could dispose of me like yesterday's newspaper. "Here's to property ownership," I whispered. "And here's to learning that every ultimatum is really just an opportunity in disguise." Some mothers would have felt guilty about what I'd done. Some mothers would have second-guessed themselves, worried about being too harsh. I wasn't some mothers. I was Bailey Gregory, property owner, and I had never felt more like myself in my entire life. I woke up at 8:30 the next morning with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for birthdays and holidays. Patricia Wilson's assistant would be knocking on Daniel's door in 30 minutes, and I wanted to be awake to savor every moment of this day. I made coffee, good coffee, not the terrible stuff from the motel, and sat by my window with a clear view of the park. Somewhere across town, my son and his wife were probably eating breakfast, getting the children ready for school, going through the motions of their normal routine. They had no idea their world was about to tilt sideways. At exactly 9:15, my phone rang. "Patricia Wilson." "Mrs. Gregory, the notice has been served." Mrs. Rebecca Gregory answered the door and accepted the papers. She seemed surprised. I could only imagine. Rebecca, in her silk pajamas and perfect makeup, opening the door expecting a package delivery and instead receiving formal eviction papers from the new owner of her house. Any immediate reaction? She asked who the new owner was. My assistant correctly told her that information would be provided through proper legal channels. Mrs. Gregory did use some rather colorful language. I smiled. I'm sure she did. What happens next? They have 30 days from today to vacate the premises. If they don't leave voluntarily, we'll begin formal eviction proceedings through the court system. I've handled many of these cases, Mrs. Gregory. One way or another, they'll be out of your house within 6 weeks. Your house. I love the sound of that. I spent the morning running errands, opening a new bank account at a different branch, buying groceries for my little apartment, picking up dry cleaning. Normal activities that felt extraordinary because I was doing them as a woman who had just taken control of her own life in the most dramatic way possible. Around noon, my old phone, the one I'd turned off for days, started buzzing frantically. I'd given Patricia my new number, but kept the old phone to monitor Daniel and Rebecca's inevitable meltdown. Time to see what they'd discovered. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, 2 voicemails. I scrolled through the texts first. What the hell did you do?
Mom, call me right now.
Bailey, this is insane. You can't do this to us. The eviction notice says the house was sold yesterday. Who bought it? Mom, please call us. There has to be some mistake. Rebecca is crying. The kids don't understand. Please fix this. I'm your son. How could you do this to your own family? The voicemails were even better. Daniel's voice cracking with panic. Mom, please call me back. There's been some kind of mistake. Someone bought our house at auction yesterday, and they're trying to evict us. We need your help figuring out who did this and how to stop it. The second voicemail was Rebecca, her voice shrill with fury. Bailey, I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but it stops now. You need to call us back immediately and explain what's happening. If you think you can manipulate us by disappearing and letting our house get sold, you're wrong. We'll figure out who bought it, and we'll fight this. I saved both voicemails. I might want to listen to them again sometime when I needed a reminder of how much they'd underestimated me.
But I wasn't ready to talk to them yet.
Let them spend a few more hours wondering, panicking, calling lawyers and real estate agents and anyone else they could think of. Let them experience the powerlessness they'd tried to impose on me. Instead, I called my old neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who lived next to my former apartment. We'd been friendly for years, and I knew she'd be concerned about my sudden disappearance. Bailey. Oh my goodness. Where have you been? Your apartment has been empty for days.
I'm fine, Ellen.
I moved out for a while. Family troubles. I'm so sorry, dear. Is there anything I can do? Actually, there is. I have some furniture and belongings in storage that I need to clear out. Would you be interested in any of it? I know you've been looking for a new dining room table. We spent a pleasant hour discussing which of my possessions she might want. It felt good to know my grandmother's china cabinet would go to someone who'd appreciate it, instead of sitting in storage indefinitely. That afternoon, I drove to the neighborhood where I used to live, where Daniel and Rebecca's house sat like a monument to their failed ambitions. I parked 2 streets over and walked through the residential area, enjoying the autumn air and the feeling of being invisible. I could see their house from the corner. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He'd obviously come home from work early. Rebecca's SUV was there too, parked at an odd angle, like she'd been in a hurry. The curtains were drawn tight, as if they could hide from the reality of what was happening. As I watched, a car pulled up and a woman in a business suit got out. She walked to the front door with purpose, probably a lawyer or a real estate agent they'd called for advice. I smiled to myself. They could consult all the professionals they wanted. The sale was legal, final, and completely irreversible.
My phone rang.
A number I didn't recognize. Hello. Mrs. Gregory? This is James Patterson, attorney at law. I'm calling on behalf of Daniel and Rebecca Gregory regarding the property at 47 Maple Street. So they'd hired a lawyer.
Good for them.
I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson, but I don't know any Daniel or Rebecca Gregory. A pause. Ma'am, I believe they're your son and daughter-in-law. I'm afraid you're mistaken. I don't have a son. I hung up and immediately blocked the number. If they wanted to bring lawyers into this, they'd have to go through Richard Cole. I wasn't going to make anything easy for them. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at an upscale bistro downtown. I ordered the salmon and a glass of white wine, and I didn't check my phone once during the meal. Let them call and text and panic. I was dining in peace for the first time in years. When I finally looked at my messages around 9 o'clock, there were 31 more texts and 9 more calls. The desperation was escalating. Mom, we hired a lawyer. He says the sale was legal. Who did this to us? Bailey, I'm begging you. Please help us figure out what happened. The kids are asking why strangers want our house. What am I supposed to tell them? Mom, I'm sorry if we hurt your feelings. Can we please talk? That last one almost made me laugh. If they hurt my feelings. As if demanding my entire life savings was just a minor social faux pas that could be smoothed over with an apology. I typed a single response. I told you I chose to lose my family. You got what you wanted. Then I turned off the phone and ran a hot bath. I added expensive bath salts I'd bought myself, lavender and eucalyptus, the kind of luxury I'd always considered wasteful. Tonight, it felt like a celebration. As I soaked in the hot water, I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worrying about Daniel's finances, wondering how I could help him, planning ways to support my family even when it meant sacrificing my own security. All those sleepless nights, all that worry, and for what? So they could call me useless when I finally said no. Well, they'd learned something about usefulness today. They'd learned that the woman they dismissed as an old fool had just outmaneuvered them completely. Tomorrow, I'd call Patricia Wilson and ask about changing the locks early. I own the house now, and I wanted to make sure no one could get in and damage the property out of spite. I was thinking like a landlord already. It felt natural, empowering, like a role I'd been meant to play all along. Some people inherit property. Some people save up for years to afford their first home. I'd bought mine with the tears of ingratitude and the currency of betrayal. It was the best investment I'd ever made. 2 weeks into their 30-day eviction notice, Daniel and Rebecca's situation became public knowledge in the way that only small-town gossip can achieve. Their lawyer had been asking questions around town, trying to discover who had bought the house. Real estate agents were talking. Neighbors were speculating. The whole thing had become a delicious mystery that everyone wanted to solve. I heard about it from Helen Martinez, my real estate agent friend, when she called to ask if I was still interested in looking at properties. Bailey, the strangest thing has happened in your son's neighborhood. Someone bought the Gregory house at foreclosure auction and immediately served eviction papers. Daniel and Rebecca are running around town like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out who did it. How terrible for them, I said, not even trying to hide the satisfaction in my voice. The thing is, everyone's puzzled because it was clearly a strategic purchase. Whoever bought it paid more than most investors would, like they wanted that specific house for personal reasons. The whole neighborhood is buzzing with theories. Personal reasons. If only they knew how personal. Have they found anywhere else to live? That's the other strange thing. Word is, their credit is so bad they can't qualify for a rental that would fit their family. Rebecca's been calling every landlord in town, but when they run the credit check, Helen made a whistling sound. It's not pretty.
Perfect.
I'd hoped their financial problems went deeper than just the mortgage. That afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance. I drove to the grocery store in their neighborhood, not to spy exactly, but to get a feel for how the situation was developing. I was in the produce section, selecting apples, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I'm telling you, Linda, it's the most bizarre thing. Someone specifically targeted their house. I turned slightly. Mrs. Patterson, Daniel's next-door neighbor, was talking to another woman by the lettuce display. But who would do such a thing? The other woman asked. That's what everyone's trying to figure out. Rebecca's beside herself. She's convinced it's someone they know, someone with a grudge. She's making lists of everyone they've ever had a disagreement with. I smiled as I bagged my apples. Make all the lists you want, Rebecca. You'll never suspect your sweet, harmless, supposedly useless mother-in-law. The saddest part, Mrs. Patterson continued, is the children. Emma keeps asking why they have to move, and little Noah has been having nightmares. It's just heartbreaking. The mention of my grandchildren gave me a small pang, but I pushed it aside. Daniel and Rebecca had made the choice to use the children as weapons when they threatened to cut me out of their lives. They'd created this situation, not me. That evening, I called Patricia Wilson for an update. How are they handling the eviction process? Not well, I'm afraid. They've been calling my office daily, demanding to speak with the property owner. Mrs. Rebecca Gregory has been particularly insistent. I can imagine. Have they been taking care of the property? My drive-by inspections show they're maintaining it adequately. No damage or neglect. They seem to be hoping this will all somehow go away. And legally? Any attempts to fight the eviction? Their attorney reviewed all the paperwork and advised them there are no grounds for appeal. The foreclosure was properly executed, the auction was legal, and the sale is binding. They have no recourse except to vacate on time. 2 weeks left. In 2 weeks, Daniel and Rebecca would be loading their belongings into a moving truck, their children confused and crying, their perfect life in ruins. The thought should have made me feel guilty. Instead, it made me feel vindicated. My phone buzzed with another text from Daniel's number. I'd been monitoring them for entertainment value. Mom, please. We know you're getting these messages. The kids are scared and confused. Don't do this to your grandchildren. Using the children again. It was pathetic how predictable they were. I typed back. I thought you said I wasn't family anymore. Why would your children's housing situation concern me? The response came immediately. MOM, please. We were upset. We said things we didn't mean. Please help us. You said exactly what you meant. You wanted my money, or you didn't want me. You made your choice. Who bought our house? Please just tell us that. I stared at the message for a long time, savoring the moment. Soon enough, they'd know. But not yet. Let them twist a little longer. Someone who recognized a good investment opportunity. I turned off the phone and poured myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow, I had an appointment to see the house with Patricia Wilson. We needed to plan for the post-eviction cleanup and any repairs that might be needed before I decided what to do with the property. The idea of walking through Daniel's house as its legal owner filled me with an anticipation that bordered on euphoria. I'd been inside that house dozens of times over the years, always as a guest, always careful not to overstay my welcome, always grateful to be included in their perfect life. Tomorrow, I'd walk through it as the person who owned every square inch of it, the person who would decide its future, the person with all the power. Some people might call what I was feeling revenge. I preferred to think of it as justice finally being served. The difference is that revenge is emotional and often unfair. Justice is cold, calculated, and precisely proportional to the offense. They tried to steal my security and leave me with nothing. Now they'd learn what nothing actually looked like. I raised my wine glass to my reflection in the window. To justice, I whispered. And to the sweet sound of chickens coming home to roost. Outside, it was starting to rain again. I found the sound soothing, like nature was washing the slate clean for whatever came next. Walking through Daniel's house as its owner was even more satisfying than I'd imagined. Patricia Wilson met me at the front door with a full set of keys, my keys now, and we spent an hour going through every room, documenting the condition and planning for the transition. The property is in better shape than I expected, Patricia said, making notes on her clipboard. The previous owners have maintained it reasonably well, considering their financial situation. Previous owners. I loved how official that sounded. The house felt different now that it was mine. Smaller somehow, less impressive. The granite countertops that Rebecca had bragged about looked dated, and the hardwood floors needed refinishing. This wasn't the palace they'd pretended it was. It was just a house, an expensive house they'd never been able to afford. "What are your plans for the property?" Patricia asked as we finished the walkthrough. "I'm not sure yet. I might rent it out or I might keep it empty for a while. I have time to decide." What I didn't tell her was that I was considering the most delicious option of all, living in it myself. Imagine Daniel and Rebecca driving by their old house and seeing me on the front porch, reading a book in the sunshine, enjoying the garden they'd abandoned. But that decision could wait. First, I wanted to complete their humiliation. That afternoon, I called Thomas Green, the private investigator Richard had recommended. I'd been thinking about our conversation regarding legal recourse, and something had been nagging at me. "Mr. Green, I'd like to hire you for a document investigation." "What kind of documents, Mrs. Gregory?" "Mortgage applications, tax returns, income verification forms. I want to know if certain people might have lied on their loan applications." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious allegation. Mortgage fraud is a federal crime." "I understand that. I also understand that people who commit federal crimes sometimes face federal consequences." We met that evening at a coffee shop downtown. Thomas Green was exactly what I'd expected, middle-aged, unremarkable, with the kind of face that could blend into any crowd. Perfect for someone whose job was to dig up information people wanted to keep buried. "What specifically are you looking for?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook. I gave him Daniel and Rebecca's full names, address, and the approximate dates of their mortgage applications and refinancing. "I want to know if the income information they provided matches their actual tax returns and employment records." "That's doable. It might take a few weeks to gather everything legally, but I have contacts at the credit agencies and some of the financial institutions." Money is no object. I want to know the truth about their financial situation. "And if I find evidence of fraud, what do you want me to do with it?" I met his eyes steadily. "I want you to prepare a complete report with all the documentation. Then I'll decide whether it needs to be shared with the appropriate authorities." He nodded. "I'll need a retainer. $5,000 to start." I wrote the check without hesitation. If Daniel and Rebecca had been honest in their loan applications, I'd be out $5,000. If they'd lied, well, then they'd be out much more than money. 3 weeks later, Thomas called with an update. "Mrs. Gregory, I think you're going to want to see this report in person. Can you meet me tomorrow afternoon?" The next day, I sat in his office while he spread documents across his desk like a detective solving a murder case. "Your instincts were correct," he said. "Daniel and Rebecca Gregory have been committing systematic mortgage fraud for years." He showed me the evidence. Income statements that inflated Daniel's salary by 40%, tax returns that had been altered before submission to lenders, fake employment verification letters from companies that didn't exist. This first mortgage application, he pointed to a document, claims Daniel was making $85,000 a year. His actual tax return for that year shows $52,000. And the refinancing? Even worse. They claimed joint income of $120,000. Their actual combined income was $71,000. They also claimed Rebecca had a part-time consulting business that generated $25,000 annually. I can't find any evidence this business ever existed. I studied the papers, amazed by the scope of their deception. They hadn't just stretched the truth. They'd created an entirely fictional financial life. Is this enough for criminal charges? More than enough. This is textbook mortgage fraud, multiple counts across several years. The FBI takes this very seriously, especially amounts this large. What would happen if someone reported this? There would be an investigation. If the evidence holds up, and it will, they'd face federal charges, prison time, massive fines, and complete financial ruin. I gathered up the copies of the documents he'd prepared for me. Thank you, Mr. Green. This is exactly what I needed to know. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the fraud report spread across my kitchen table. Each falsified document was another nail in the coffin of their future. They'd built their entire lifestyle on lies, and now those lies were about to bury them.
But I wanted to be smart about this.
I called Richard Cole. Richard, hypothetically, if someone discovered evidence of mortgage fraud, what would be the proper way to report it? Hypothetically, they'd contact the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the District Attorney's Office. Both agencies have task forces specifically for mortgage fraud cases. And the person reporting it, would they need to be involved in the prosecution? Possibly as a witness, but the government would handle the case. Once it's reported, it's out of the individual's hands.
Perfect.
I could light the fuse and then step back to watch the explosion. I spent the next day thinking about timing. Daniel and Rebecca had 1 week left before their eviction was final. They'd been scrambling to find a new place to live, probably assuming that once they moved out, their troubles would be over. They were about to learn that their troubles were just beginning. On Monday morning, I drove to the FBI field office in the federal building downtown. I wore my best suit and my pearls, looking like exactly what I was, a respectable citizen with important information to share. I'd like to report a case of mortgage fraud, I told the receptionist. An hour later, I sat across from Special Agent Sarah Martinez, handing over copies of Thomas Green's investigation. She reviewed the documents with the same methodical attention I'd once used to review patient charts. "This is very thorough," she said finally. "Where did you obtain these documents?" "I hired a private investigator. I had suspicions about these individuals' financial honesty and your relationship to the subjects." I met her eyes steadily. They're former acquaintances who attempted to defraud me personally. When that failed, I became curious about their other activities. She made notes in her file. "We'll need to verify all of this independently, but if it checks out, we'll be moving forward with charges." This level of systematic fraud typically results in significant penalties. How significant? Multiple felony counts, several years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture, and permanent destruction of their credit and employment prospects. I nodded soberly, as if this news was regrettable rather than exactly what I'd hoped to hear. "I understand." I just felt it was my civic duty to report what I discovered. As I left the federal building, I felt lighter than I had in months. The wheels of justice were now in motion, and there was nothing Daniel or Rebecca could do to stop them. They'd wanted my money because they thought they deserved it. Instead, they were about to lose everything because they'd try to take what didn't belong to them. Some people call that irony. I called it perfect. I was having coffee on the balcony of my apartment when it happened. It was 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 3 days after Daniel and Rebecca had finally moved out of my house. I'd been watching the sun rise and thinking about what color to paint the guest bedroom when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Local couple arrested in federal mortgage fraud case. I opened the article with steady hands, though my heart was racing with anticipation. Daniel Gregory, 38, and Rebecca Gregory, 35, were arrested this morning at their temporary residence on charges of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to financial institutions. The couple allegedly falsified income documents and tax returns to obtain mortgages totaling more than $400,000 over a 3-year period. FBI's Special Agent Sarah Martinez stated that the investigation began following a tip from a concerned citizen. "This case represents systematic fraud across multiple loan applications," Martinez said. "The defendants created fictional income sources and inflated their actual earnings by more than 50%. The couple appeared in federal court this afternoon and pleaded not guilty to all charges. They were released on $50,000 bond each, pending trial. If convicted, they face up to 30 years in prison and fines of up to $1 million. I set down my coffee cup and read the article again, savoring every word. Then I called Patricia Wilson. Patricia, I assume you saw the news about the former tenants? I did indeed. Quite dramatic. I've never had rental property connected to a federal case before. Will this affect the property in any way? Not at all. You purchased it legally through foreclosure. Their criminal activities are completely separate from your ownership.
Perfect.
I've been briefly concerned that their arrest might somehow complicate my ownership of the house, but Patricia's reassurance put that worry to rest. Next, I called Thomas Green to thank him for his thorough work. I saw the arrests on the morning news, he said. I have to say, Mrs. Gregory, you have excellent instincts. Most people wouldn't have thought to investigate mortgage fraud. I've always believed that people who lie about small things probably lie about big things too. Well, you were certainly right about that. The FBI agent I spoke with said this was one of the most clear-cut cases she'd seen. The evidence was overwhelming. After I hung up, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Everything was falling into place exactly as I'd planned. Daniel and Rebecca weren't just homeless now. They were facing federal prison time. Their children would grow up knowing their parents were convicted felons. Rebecca's perfect reputation was destroyed forever. Most importantly, they now understood that the woman they dismissed as useless had orchestrated their complete downfall. Around noon, my old phone started buzzing frantically. Daniel's number appeared on the screen, followed immediately by a call from a number I didn't recognize, probably Rebecca calling from jail. I let them ring. Whatever they wanted to say, I wasn't interested in hearing it. But curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I checked the voicemails that evening. Daniel's voice was barely recognizable, cracked with panic and desperation. Mom, please pick up. I know you're there. The FBI arrested us this morning. They say someone reported us for mortgage fraud. I need you to help me understand what's happening. Please call me back. The kids are staying with Rebecca's sister, and they're scared and confused.
Please, Mom.
I need my mother right now. I need my mother right now. Where was that sentiment when he told me I was worthless unless I handed over my retirement savings? Rebecca's message was shorter and angrier. Bailey, I don't know what you've done, but I know this is your fault somehow. You disappear for weeks, then suddenly we're arrested for fraud? That's not a coincidence. Call me back immediately. We need to talk. I deleted both messages without a second thought. The next morning brought even better news. The local newspaper had picked up the story, complete with photographs from their arraignment. Daniel looked haggard and desperate in his wrinkled suit. Rebecca's perfect composure had cracked completely. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, her face showing the strain of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed overnight. The article included more details about the charges. The FBI had found evidence of fraud dating back 5 years, involving not just their primary residence, but also a vacation property they'd purchased and quickly lost to foreclosure. The total amount of fraudulent loans exceeded $600,000. I clipped the article and put it in the folder with all the other documents from this saga. Someday, I might want to remember exactly how justice looked when it finally arrived. That afternoon, I drove to my house, and it felt wonderful to think of it that way, to check on the condition after Daniel and Rebecca's departure. Patricia had given me a preliminary report, but I wanted to see it for myself. They'd left it clean, I had to give them that. The carpets had been vacuumed, the windows were spotless, and they'd even left a note on the kitchen counter. Thank you for letting us live here. We're sorry we couldn't take better care of it. The note was signed by both of them, but I could tell it was Rebecca's handwriting. Even in defeat, she couldn't resist one last passive-aggressive jab, pretending they'd been tenants rather than acknowledging that I'd taken their home away from them. I threw the note in the trash and spend an hour walking through the empty rooms, planning changes. The master bedroom would become my art studio, something I'd always wanted but never had space for. The formal dining room would become a library, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The kitchen was actually quite nice once you got past Rebecca's gaudy decorating choices. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I started thinking about the future instead of the past. I could sell my little apartment and move here permanently. I could afford to make the house exactly what I wanted it to be. I could plant a garden, join the neighborhood book club, maybe even get a dog. As I locked the door and walked back to my car, I noticed Mrs. Patterson working in her front yard. She waved, and I walked over to say hello. Mrs. Gregory. I was so surprised to hear about Daniel and Rebecca. Such a shock. Yes, it must have been. And that whole business with the foreclosure and the mysterious buyer, did they ever find out who purchased the house? I smiled my most innocent smile. I believe they did, eventually. Well, I hope whoever bought it will be a good neighbor. This has always been such a quiet, respectable street. I'm sure it will continue to be. As I drove home, I thought about Mrs. Patterson's face when she eventually learned that the mysterious buyer was the supposedly harmless grandmother she'd been chatting with. The whole neighborhood would talk about it for months. Let them talk. I had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. I'd simply recognized an opportunity and taken it, using nothing but legal means and public information. If Daniel and Rebecca had been honest about their finances, none of this would have happened. If they hadn't tried to extort my life savings, I never would have investigated their mortgage situation. If they'd treated me with respect instead of contempt, I would have remained the doting mother and grandmother they could take advantage of indefinitely. They'd created every link in the chain of events that led to their arrest. I'd simply recognized the pattern and helped it reach its logical conclusion. Some people might call that cold-blooded. I prefer to think of it as efficient. The trial began 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning that felt like a rebirth. I dressed carefully in my navy suit and pearls, looking every inch the respectable citizen I was. The media had lost interest in the case by then. Mortgage fraud wasn't sensational enough to hold the public's attention for long, but I wanted to be there for every moment of it. I sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery, close enough to see everything but far enough away to remain anonymous. Daniel and Rebecca sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed attorney, a harried-looking young man who clearly understood he was fighting a losing battle. Rebecca had lost weight during the months leading up to trial. Her perfect blonde hair was now showing dark roots, and the designer clothes had been replaced with a simple black dress that looked like it came from a discount store. Daniel appeared to have aged 5 years and 6 months, his boyish face now gaunt and lined with stress. Neither of them had seen me enter the courtroom. They were too focused on their attorney's whispered explanations and the intimidating presence of the federal prosecutor's table, where 3 serious-looking lawyers were arranging stacks of evidence with military precision. The prosecutor was Linda Vaughn, a woman about my age with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. During her opening statement, she laid out the case with surgical precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next few days you will hear about a deliberate, systematic scheme to defraud multiple financial institutions. The defendants, Daniel and Rebecca Gregory, didn't make simple mistakes on their loan applications. They created entirely fictional financial profiles, complete with fake tax returns, inflated income statements, and non-existent businesses. She walked to a chart showing the timeline of their loans. In 2019, they claimed combined income of $95,000 when their actual income was $63,000. In 2021, they claimed $120,000 when their actual income was $71,000. They obtained nearly $600,000 in fraudulent loans using these false statements. I watched Daniel and Rebecca's faces as the prosecutor spoke. Rebecca kept her chin up, trying to maintain some dignity, but I could see her hands shaking in her lap. Daniel stared at the table, apparently unable to look at the jury that would decide his fate. This wasn't desperation, Prosecutor Vaughn continued. This was greed. The defendants wanted a lifestyle they couldn't afford, so they lied, repeatedly and deliberately, to get it. The defense attorney's opening statement was pathetic. He tried to paint Daniel and Rebecca as victims of predatory lending, claiming they'd been encouraged to inflate their income by unscrupulous loan officers. He suggested they were naive rather than criminal, confused rather than calculating. The jury looked skeptical. These weren't sympathetic defendants. They were an attractive, educated couple who had systematically cheated the system for years. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. They presented the original loan applications alongside the actual tax returns, showing the stark differences. They brought in handwriting experts who confirmed that the falsified documents had been altered by the defendants themselves. The star witness was Thomas Green, my private investigator. He testified about his investigation methodology and the evidence he'd uncovered, presenting it all with professional detachment. He never mentioned who had hired him or why, referring only to a concerned citizen who provided the initial tip. When the defense attorney cross-examined him, trying to suggest his investigation had been biased or incomplete, Thomas remained unflappable. Sir, I simply gathered publicly available documents and compared them to the loan applications. The discrepancies were obvious and significant. Any competent investigator would have reached the same conclusions. On the second day, they called Daniel to testify in his own defense. It was a disaster. Mr. Gregory, Prosecutor Vaughn said during cross-examination, when you signed this loan application stating your annual income was $85,000, what was your actual annual income? I thought it might go up that year. I was expecting a promotion. But you didn't have a promotion, did you? And your actual income that year was $52,000, correct? Yes, but... So you lied on a federal document to obtain money you weren't entitled to? Daniel's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury could see that Daniel had no real defense for his actions. Rebecca's testimony was even worse. She tried to blame Daniel for everything, claiming she'd just signed papers he'd prepared without reading them carefully. When the prosecutor showed her a fake business license she'd created for her non-existent consulting company, complete with her own signature and notarization, that excuse fell apart completely. Mrs. Gregory, did your husband force you to create this fraudulent business license? No, but I thought, did your husband force you to notarize your own signature, pretending to be someone else? I was just trying to help. Help yourself to money that didn't belong to you? Rebecca's composure finally cracked. She started crying on the witness stand, which only made her look more guilty. The jury watched with the kind of uncomfortable silence that fills a room when someone's lies are being exposed in real time. I found myself leaning forward, not wanting to miss a single moment of their humiliation. This was better than I'd imagined. Watching them destroy themselves with their own words, their own contradictions, their own desperate attempts to escape responsibility for their choices. The closing arguments were anticlimactic. The defense attorney made one last plea for mercy, suggesting that Daniel and Rebecca had made mistakes and learned their lesson. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Prosecutor Vaughn's closing was brief and devastating. The defendants want you to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that they're victims rather than criminals. But the evidence shows a pattern of deliberate fraud spanning 5 years. They didn't make mistakes, they made choices. Criminal choices. And now they must face the consequences of those choices. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, I watched Daniel and Rebecca stand to face their judgment. Rebecca was clutching Daniel's arms so tightly her knuckles were white. Daniel was swaying slightly, as if he might faint. On the charge of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, we find the defendant Daniel Gregory guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, we find the defendant Rebecca Gregory guilty. The judge read through all the charges: wire fraud, making false statements to financial institutions, conspiracy, and the verdict was the same for each one.
Guilty. Guilty. Guilty.
I watched Rebecca collapse into her chair, sobbing openly now. Daniel just stood there, staring at nothing, apparently unable to process what had just happened to his life. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later and remanded them to custody pending a pre-sentence investigation. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Rebecca looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone, who might help her. For just a moment, her eyes met mine across the crowded gallery. I saw recognition flicker across her face, followed by something that might have been understanding. She knew. Finally, after all these months, she knew who had destroyed her life. I smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a triumphant one, just a small, satisfied smile that said, "You wanted to know who bought your house. Now you know." As they were led away in handcuffs, I gathered my purse and walked calmly out of the courtroom. In the hallway, reporters were already updating their stories on laptops and phones. This would be a small item in tomorrow's paper, buried on page 6 or 7. Local couple convicted in mortgage fraud case. But for me, it was front-page news. It was vindication, justice, and closure all wrapped up in one perfect verdict. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the neighborhoods where Daniel and Rebecca had once pretended to belong. Past the country club where Rebecca had played tennis with women who would never speak to her again. Past the private school Emma and Noah had attended before their parents' arrest made tuition impossible. When I got to my apartment, I poured myself a glass of champagne. Good champagne, the kind I'd always saved for special occasions that never seemed to come. Tonight felt like the most special occasion of my life. I raised my glass to the empty room and spoke the words I'd been waiting months to say. Justice is served. Tomorrow, I would start planning my move into the house that was now truly, completely, legally mine. Tonight, I would savor the knowledge that Daniel and Rebecca were sitting in jail cells, finally understanding the consequences of treating people like disposable assets. They'd wanted my money or my absence from their lives. They'd gotten my absence, all right, along with the loss of their home, their freedom, and their future. Some people might call that excessive. I called it proportional. They'd tried to take everything from me. I'd simply returned the favor. Sentencing day arrived with the quiet finality of a door closing forever. Judge William Simmons, a stern man with silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses, had a reputation for imposing harsh sentences on white-collar criminals. I'd done my research. I arrived at the courthouse early and took the same seat I'd occupied during the trial. Daniel and Rebecca were already at the defendant's table, wearing the same clothes they'd worn for their conviction. Rebecca had lost even more weight, and Daniel's hands shook as he shuffled through papers with his attorney. The courtroom was nearly empty this time. No media, no curious neighbors, just the necessary officials, a few family members, and me. Rebecca's sister sat 2 rows ahead of me, her face tight with the kind of anger that comes from having your life disrupted by someone else's poor choices. I assumed Emma and Noah were staying with her, probably struggling to understand why their parents had disappeared into the justice system. I felt no sympathy for the children's confusion. Their parents had created this situation. Their parents had chosen crime over responsibility, greed over integrity. The children were casualties of Daniel and Rebecca's decisions, not mine. Judge Simmons reviewed the pre-sentence reports methodically, his face revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Mr. and Mrs. Gregory, you have been convicted of multiple felonies involving systematic mortgage fraud. The court has reviewed your financial history, your criminal history or lack thereof, and the impact statements from the affected financial institutions. He paused, looking directly at them. The prosecution has recommended sentences of 8 to 10 years in federal prison, along with complete asset forfeiture and restitution in the amount of $674,000. Rebecca made a small choking sound. Daniel closed his eyes as if he could make this moment disappear. The defense has asked for leniency, citing your status as first-time offenders and your responsibilities as parents. However, this court must consider the deliberate nature of your crimes and the sophisticated methods you used to defraud multiple institutions over a period of 5 years. Judge Simmons consulted his notes. Mrs. Gregory, you created fake business entities, falsified tax documents, and personally notarized fraudulent papers. Mr. Gregory, you systematically inflated income figures and forged employment verification letters. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a carefully planned criminal enterprise. The judge sentenced Rebecca to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Daniel received 8 years, slightly longer, because he'd been the primary architect of their schemes. Both were ordered to pay full restitution of $674,000, essentially guaranteeing they'd be financially ruined for the rest of their lives. Furthermore, Judge Simmons continued, all assets acquired through fraudulent loans are subject to immediate forfeiture. This includes any vehicles, property, or personal items purchased with the proceeds of your crimes. I almost laughed. The house they'd lost was already mine, purchased legally at foreclosure auction. The government could seize whatever else they had, furniture, cars, jewelry, but the big prize was already beyond their reach. As the bailiff approached to escort them back to custody, Rebecca finally broke down completely. She sobbed with the raw desperation of someone who'd finally realized the full scope of her destruction. Daniel tried to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking too badly to be of much use. Neither of them looked toward the gallery this time. They were too consumed by their own misery to notice the woman who'd orchestrated their downfall sitting quietly in the back row, watching their lives end with the calm satisfaction of a job well done. After they were led away, I sat in the empty courtroom for a few minutes longer, absorbing the finality of it all. 7 and 8 years in prison. Complete financial ruin. Their children would be adults by the time they were released, raised by relatives who would always remember why their parents had abandoned them. It was more thorough than anything I could have planned myself. I drove directly from the courthouse to my house. And after 10 months of owning it, it truly felt like mine now. Patricia Wilson had handed over all the management responsibilities to me the month before, since there were no longer any tenants to evict or legal complications to navigate. I'd already moved most of my belongings from the apartment. The master bedroom was now my sanctuary, decorated with antiques I'd been storing for years. The formal dining room had become my library, lined with built-in bookshelves and a comfortable reading chair by the window. I'd converted Rebecca's pretentious home office into an art studio, complete with an easel and natural lighting. But the room I loved most was the kitchen. I'd had it completely renovated, stripping away Rebecca's gaudy granite countertops and replacing them with classic marble. The walls were now a warm cream color instead of the aggressive red Rebecca had chosen. It felt peaceful, elegant, like a kitchen where someone could actually cook instead of just pose for photographs. I made myself lunch and ate it at the kitchen table, looking out at the garden I'd been cultivating for months. The roses were blooming beautifully, and I'd planted herbs in neat rows along the back fence. It was the kind of garden I'd always wanted but never had space for in my apartment. After lunch, I called Richard Cole to give him the news about the sentencing. "Bailey, are you satisfied with how everything turned out?" "Completely. Justice was served, and I have my peaceful retirement back." "And you're really planning to stay in that house permanently?" "Why not? It's a beautiful house in a good neighborhood. I can afford to maintain it and I enjoy the space. It feels like home. What I didn't tell Richard was how much I enjoyed the symbolic victory of it all. Every morning, I woke up in the master bedroom where Daniel and Rebecca had planned their fraudulent schemes. Every evening, I cooked dinner in the kitchen where they'd counted money they'd stolen from banks. I walked through rooms where they'd felt safe and superior, and I'd transformed those spaces into something peaceful and honest. Sometimes neighbors asked about the previous owners. I always responded with polite neutrality. Oh, they had some legal troubles and had to move. Such a shame. I never mentioned that I was Daniel's mother, and no one ever made the connection. After all, what elderly woman would destroy her own son's life so completely? That evening, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Mrs. Patterson waved from her yard next door, and we chatted briefly about the weather and the neighborhood book club meeting next week. It's so nice to have someone quiet and stable in that house, she said. The previous owners were lovely people, but there was always so much drama. Police cars, attorneys, reporters, it was exhausting. I prefer a peaceful life, I said mildly. After she went inside, I remained on the porch as darkness fell. This was my favorite time of day, when the neighborhood settled into evening routines and I could sit with my thoughts in complete tranquility. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, probably Rebecca's sister, trying to reach me about the children. I'd been expecting this contact for months. Mrs. Gregory, this is Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca's sister. Emma and Noah ask about their grandmother sometimes. Would you like to see them? I stared at the message for a long time. Emma and Noah, 8 and 6 when this all started, now 9 and 7. Old enough to understand that their parents were in prison, but not old enough to understand why. I could arrange a visit. I could explain that Mommy and Daddy had made some bad choices, but that grandmother still loved them. I could become part of their lives again, help them navigate the trauma their parents had created. But that would require forgiveness. It would require pretending that Daniel and Rebecca's betrayal hadn't revealed their true nature. It would require rebuilding relationships with people who had shown me exactly how little I meant to them. I deleted the message without responding. Daniel and Rebecca had made their choice when they gave me that ultimatum. They'd chosen to treat me as disposable, valuable only for my money. They'd weaponized my love for my grandchildren, using it as leverage to extort my life savings. Now they were living with the consequences of that choice. All of them. I turned off my phone and went inside to my beautiful, peaceful house. Tomorrow, I would tend my garden and read my books and enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a life finally lived on my own terms. Some stories end with reconciliation and forgiveness. Some stories end with families healing and love conquering all. This story ended with a 64-year-old woman sitting in her own home, surrounded by her own belongings, accountable to no one but herself. It ended with justice served and debts paid in full. It ended exactly as it should have. I locked the door behind me, my door, my house, my choice, and settled into my reading chair with a new novel I'd been saving for a special occasion. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet and safe, the kind of place where people minded their own business and treated each other with respect. Inside, I was finally home. The Old Bailey would have felt guilty about Emma and Noah growing up without their grandmother. The Old Bailey would have agonized over whether she'd been too harsh, too unforgiving. But the Old Bailey was gone, and good riddance to her. What remained was a woman who understood that some betrayals are unforgivable, some choices have permanent consequences, and some bridges are meant to be burned. I opened my book and began to read, surrounded by the profound silence of a life finally lived without compromise. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. If Bailey's story of reclaiming her power and refusing to be anyone's victim resonates with you, I want you to know something. It's never too late to rewrite your story. Age is not a limitation, it's wisdom. Experience is not a weakness, it's strength. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, contains the tools and strategies that helped Bailey transform from victim to victor. Don't let anyone convince you that your best chapters are behind you. Click the link in the description to order your copy today and start writing the ending you deserve. Bailey refused to be discarded, and so should you. Like this video if her journey inspired you to stand up for yourself. Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to be victims. And hit that notification bell because everyone deserves to know that it's never too late to demand the respect you've always deserved. Your story isn't over. It's just getting started.